Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Greenleaf webinar on gender equality and responsible business expanding CSR horizons. My name is Lauren McCarthy. I'm at Copenhagen Business School in the Department for Intercultural Communication and Management. And I'm going to be co-hosting the event today. And I hope that you will enjoy the session and be inspired to read more. Our authors Alison Harvey, Florence Shi and Torsten Busch explore gender and digital gaming in their chapter.
And they raise really interesting questions here about the role of technology companies who sell the games or host tech events. They also raise questions about, well, what does online trolling say about the current state of misogyny in modern society? And how might CSR and companies play a role in that, for better or worse? We also see Charlotte Holgerson and Stephanie Togerson exploring corporate responsibilities around the buying of sex and viewing of pornography whilst on business trips. Now, originally we might have thought about things like buying sex and pornography as being a personal responsibility, nothing to do with a corporation, but actually, how might corporate sexual responsibility be a concept that we now want to start considering when we think about gender equality and responsible business? And finally, you'll hear from Felicity later on about how might CSR in the form of fair trade be pushing the issue of paying for domestic and care work back into the picture. And so I think what's really interesting is that areas previously thought of as a personal responsibility, so be it our online activity, our sex lives, domestic work, they become tied into a bigger picture of collective and corporate issues of gender equality. So I hope that brief introduction has given you some food for thought and maybe prompted you to think of some questions, and also enticing you to have a look at the book and their chapters themselves. But for now, I think I'll pass over to Kate and see if she has any other points she'd like to pick up.
Thank you so much for joining our webinar, and we're very excited to be launching this book, which has been a long time in the making. Thanks for the introduction, Lauren. So I won't add very much. It's just to say a couple of other things I'm particularly happy about in terms of the book. I really increasingly think that as more and more corporations jump on the bandwagon and say they or attempt to do work about gender and CSR, so we need to be critically examining those and trying to help improve them. So you may note that there's, a lot of feminist scholars who are very critical of corporations and CSR, really grounded in the idea that gender inequality is a resource for corporations who exploit women's low pay globally, for example, and rely on unpaid care work done by women to sustain them. But it's also, and while those points are very valid, it's also true that business has a growing role in society, and that it has the power in many forms to make changes that can impact large numbers of women in positive ways through new kinds of business models and approaches to responsible business. But corporate claims to be doing this need to be evaluated by us as feminist scholars, and particularly in collaboration with the recipients of those people who are supposedly benefiting from a gendered approach to CSR. So what I'm particularly happy about in this book is that we've got a number of people contributing both from business, NGOs, but also academia, who are critical but also engaged, trying to move the debate forward rather than just lob criticisms, valid though they might be. So I sort of wanted to emphasize that we've set out with the aim of stimulating debate, stimulating criticism, but doing so in a way that might be helpful to practitioners as well as academics. That's one thing. I think, so basically those two things really, kind of critical and engaged together, is what I'm pleased about. And Lauren's outlined a lot of what's in the book, so I'm not going to go over that again, but just also to add, there are numerous things we obviously couldn't cover. And so our book points to new research directions, and just to name a few, we need to be doing more work on gender and human business and human rights, which emerges in some of the chapters but isn't directly addressed very substantially. There's work on responsible marketing, on gender and the environmental impacts of companies in context of ecofeminism, discussion about corporate tax as a feminist issue in terms of how do we pay for the services that young people, women's unpaid work means that they're often poor in old age. How do we ensure that corporations actually contribute to the welfare of those people who are not direct stakeholders, for example, in a world where they have increasing power? We envisage more work on corporate sexual responsibility, particularly in a digital age, and more discussion about how the normalization of violence against women is taking place in online pornography, for example, and the relationship between the porn industry and those companies that champion gender equality but don't want to talk about those issues just at the moment. And I guess finally, there's a whole lot of emerging work on masculinity, and particularly hegemonic masculinity in CSR. And there's a lot of opportunity to talk more about men and men's roles in gender equality in the context of the role of business. Things we haven't even touched on in that introductory chapter would also include how we could bring in the GLBTI work, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, intersex, etc. Work that takes place in other fields of academia and in some parts of business, how we could bring that into the debate about gender equality and CSR as an area for the future. It would also be really good if we could cover more sector-specific examples in, for example, the mining sector, where there's a lot of work going on. But we couldn't cover everything, and we put out our corporate chapters, and we're very happy with what we've got so far. I think I might leave it there, particularly as it's late at night here, and see what our contributors are going to say about their chapters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. So now we'll hand over to Erinch. Over to you, Erinch.
Great, thank you very much. I'm hoping that you can all hear me clearly. I'm here at in a sunny, surprisingly sunny Oxford at the moment, on a Friday morning, and essentially what I'm going to talk about, and I'll be as brief as possible, is a story about how change happens. It's a story from a campaign that we've run for the last few years, which did have a significant focus on the role that women play in global supply chains in the food sector. And it's much less about the what aspects of the change that's needed, because it varies so much, and it's difficult to be prescriptive or specific about the changes that will address some of the systemic challenges faced by women in global supply chains, but more so about the how change can happen and the levers that can be pulled to change business behavior. So essentially what we did is start off with an analysis of, we want to move the behavior of some of the world's largest companies so that they use their power to transform how their supply chains work. And there were levers that really could be summarized into four, into trying to build the power of the individuals, the workers, the communities and farmers, trying to yield and influence government power and how they can force companies to behave differently, how we can use the pulling power of consumers and of investors, the two stakeholders that business listens to most intently. This is a campaign that focused on the latter two, on the pulling power of consumers and investors to achieve some of that change. And it focused on some of the largest and most recognizable brands in the world. We selected the 10 largest food and beverage companies, not just because of their reach in terms of the millions of suppliers that feed into their supply chains, that produce the ingredients that go into the foods that they sell in just about every country in the world, but also because of their symbolic power. Some of the insights that we gained were that when a Coca-Cola or a Nestle does something differently or expects something differently, it moves a whole sector because it is recognized as a bit of a standard bearer sometimes by the supply chain of what's necessary and what's to come. And we started off the campaign back in 2013 with highlighting the various difficulties, the various issues that women in the supply chains of some of these companies face. And we specifically focused on chocolate because 3 of those companies, Mondelez, Nestle, and Mars, control about 40% of the world's chocolate market. And they, together, if they were to act, could transform the roles that women play in cocoa farming, particularly in West Africa, where the majority of the world's cocoa comes from. And we really want to highlight the hidden roles that women face in terms of addressing, some of the disempowerment that seems so obvious to us, but not to the companies. So what we did is, essentially, we looked at what the companies were already doing. And we said, where are you going wrong? What could you do differently? And as you can see from the asks that we put to the companies, it wasn't about giving them the solutions, but getting them to engage deeply about the specific barriers that women in their supply chains faced. And what resulted was they were able to understand that actually women played a much more important role in the pre and post-harvest work. Incidentally, the stages of the cocoa process that really determine the quality of the cocoa than the companies had anticipated. A lot of the economics of the supply chain would be dealt by the men, and a lot of what would be deemed the more productive work would be dealt by the men. But the women were playing a much more significant role than the companies had realized. And the knowing and showing elements of that were really what we were trying to trigger the company to do in their own right, and to make it public critically. And we asked them to commit to a plan of action to try to address some of these barriers and recognize what they could do as some of the most powerful actors in the supply chain and some of the biggest buyers in the supply chain. And lastly, we asked them to influence other powerful public and private actors. So their voice can really shift some of the political dynamics in these countries and try to get women's rights and women's empowerment onto the agenda of agricultural policymakers and government policymakers who are absolutely desperate to draw in investment from companies like Nestle, Mars, and Mondelez. So basically what resulted from the campaigning that we did, and we had over 100,000 people take action, posting on their Twitter wall, posting on their Facebook wall, signing petitions, turning up to what we would call campaign stunts in front of their offices to challenge them to do more to tackle women's disempowerment in their supply chain. Was all 3 did essentially make the commitment and start taking the steps that we'd asked them to. But that obviously is the beginning of the journey, a journey that started off in a place that was very gender blind, and we've been following up with the companies and critiquing them publicly where they've fallen short of what would be expected from a company that makes such a bold commitment. But essentially, we learned a whole range of lessons from these engagements, and the lessons really aren't only specific to women's empowerment in global supply chains, but they're specific to most changes that you might be able to get from engaging and challenging global brands that yield significant amounts of power and could change the behavior of many other actors. The first lesson was really to try to trigger a race to the top and leverage the competitive spirit of these companies. I personally used to work in the food and beverage sector and know that is what drives every single behavior is really winning in the market, increasing market share, growing the brand, growing the brand's loyalty as well among consumers, and instilling that into the competitive spirit of the companies was critical. What resulted was companies were beginning to have a lot of internal discussions about, oh right, where are we on the Oxfam scorecard? How do we rank against our competitors on this issue? And having a sustained way of measuring and assessing them was critical. Secondly, being a critical friend. I mean, the term's been used already in this webinar, but essentially, from our perspective, what worked was when we were able to both challenge them and say that you're not doing enough, but refrain from any calls to boycott, because once you've called on consumers to boycott, then you've kind of lost your leverage as well with the brands. And the most important thing was to kind of say that, look, consumers expect better of you, the public expects better of you, and you can do better if you'd like to do better, and then congratulate them when they do move and take some of the steps. So it's trying to, I guess, keep consumers engaged and keep the consumer power going with the companies was key. Thirdly, it was to engage deeply with the companies and the sector so that they were prepared to take the kind of steps that we were calling on them to take in the public realm. We had dialogue with the companies months before we started any public campaigning, and we had that dialogue informed what would make sense to ask them to address some of these issues. There are always internal champions in companies, and aligning, I guess, your own priorities to move the needle with those internal champions was key. And having that engagement with the sector and more broadly, including in places like Davos, where our executive director was one of the co-chairs at the time, and raising the issue that businesses are clearly that's been signed by $1.4 trillion of investors, who are essentially the institutional shareholders and the institutional investors that drive the share price, and who have enormous sway over the boards of these companies. Getting them to talk about the issues that Oxfam was raising was absolutely key. We were able to get multiple pension funds to pick up the phone to members of the board and say, we're a bit concerned. Why wouldn't you be adopting policies that try to address some of the challenges faced by women? Why wouldn't you be adopting policies to stop land grabs in your supply chain? This sounds like a big risk. And as your investor, we'd like to see you do more on this. Those sorts of actions, when triangulated and happening at the same time as some of the external campaigning and the internal dialogue that we were having with the companies, really was, I think, key to any of the changes that we were able to achieve. Not to overemphasize those changes, because there's still a long way to go. Fifth, the focus on public information was key, because it was never about just those 3 companies or the 10 more broadly. It was about the sector, and it was about what other actors in the agricultural system and global supply chains expected of each other. And there's no point in confidentially doing things that might be empowering women. It was critical that we saw them talking about doing this and made it very much front of mind for their sustainability reporting, for any of their public engagement. So what was key for us is that we only rewarded companies in the scorecard, and you saw the scorecard in an earlier slide, where there was publicly available information demonstrating that they were doing something positive. The next point was really about making sure that we had full disclosure as well. If we were asking for publicly available information in order to reward companies, we need to make sure that we were walking the talk ourselves. So everything we did in terms of the scorecard, the 300 plus indicators that underpin it for each of the 10 companies, the assessment, the reference point which we used to assess them, all of this was made public and is available on the website, which was a key part of I think retaining some credibility around what we were assessing. Seventh, it was about updating the indicators and sharpening them very regularly, so that there were different points in time that companies were looking to along the future and saying that, we could actually leapfrog our competitor the next time the update happens, and keeping them abreast of when those updates were coming. And lastly, it was about engaging the public. The key point, I guess, there is that these are companies that are driven by the value of their brands, and having that constant pressure from the hundreds of thousands of consumers around the world. And we ended up with 100,000 for the specific action we did on women's empowerment, but over 700,000 globally for the campaign as a whole, including land rights and climate change being the other 2 areas of focus that we focused on. That public engagement, making it simpler, trying to turn some of the complexity of sustainability reporting into easily digestible information that allows us to hold companies to account was critical. So In terms of the advancement across the board, not just on women's empowerment, but on other issues, you can see there that February 2013, on land and on gender especially, the companies were particularly poor. By 2016, they had lots more policies. They had signed up to various instruments, but also started putting women's empowerment into their supplier codes, into the way they were engaging with suppliers, and essentially what they were asking the suppliers to address. So I'll stop there, but essentially, I mean, I think that the big lessons for us are that we can change big companies. It's not about changing them one by one, but picking the kind of more systemic levers that can use the bigger brands and the bigger companies to change others in the sector and try to transform some of the norms that infiltrate the way everybody behaves. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Eric. That was a really interesting presentation. We'll take some questions at the end, and now we'll move on to Felicity Butler's presentation. Felicity, if you'd like to start.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for such an interesting discussion so far, and to Greenleaf for hosting this webinar. My name is Felicity Butler, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Royal Holloway. My research, which I'll be talking about today, focuses on the unpaid work of women in two fair trade supply chains, coffee and sesame in Nicaragua. It is a longitudinal study, and I'm currently in the analysis and writing up stage of my thesis. It is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and is in partnership with The Body Shop. Today, I'll be presenting some initial findings and reflections, and end by talking about why it's an interesting case study and what can be learned from it. I'm going to start my presentation by setting the scene. So to begin, despite decades of feminist campaigning, work traditionally done by women, including care work undertaken for the family and labour undertaken on family farms and enterprises, remains largely invisible, undervalued and unremunerated. In the context of fair trade, paying a fair price and a fair wage is equated with empowerment, and gender and women's empowerment are considered integral to the system. Women's involvement in fair trade is considerable. There are a growing number of gender impact case studies that document this. A number of studies show that fair trade can have a beneficial effect on women as well as men. However, little is known about the impacts of fair trade on the well-being of individual members of families, which has been criticised as the blind spot of fair trade, whereby the system avoids opening the black box of household relations, including the work conditions of the family labour force and the distribution of family benefits. More recently, it has been noted that there are few gender-focused studies that examine minimum price guarantees, an area that has a strong potential for impact and one which my study focuses on. In recent years, there has been a growing focus on gender in supply chains, and women-only products such as coffee are now available in major supermarkets. There is also an increasing business logic being documented as to why it is important to prioritise gender empowerment. In supply chains, the business argument is that by increasing women's participation, you can improve crop productivity and quality, increase stability and security of supply chains, create resilient households, which is important for climate change, grow the smallholder supply base, create more robust cooperatives, improve access to high-value markets, and be a commercial opportunity for enhancing the ethical credentials of companies, the latter two of which can be critical for winning business and increasing market share. So the enter the Body Shop and a new pricing model to include women's unpaid labour. The story begins back in 2006 when the Body Shop were visiting Nicaragua on a regular producer-led visit to review their pricing. This coincided with a visit from a UK feminist and academic who was also visiting the cooperative. Catherine Hoskins spent a day doing a field visit with a head buyer and was surprised and irritated to see that the Excel sheet of costs that they had reviewed together said days laboured by men plus other puts after they'd spent the whole day observing women's work. Where were the women, she asked in the costings. This opened up dialogue on women's unpaid labour and led eventually to a new pricing model with the Body Shop, which was adopted in 2008. The pricing of unpaid work was approved based on a one-time use survey undertaken with one family. It was later agreed that this merited more work, and hence my PhD and my work on time use surveys within this. However, the innovation of the model is that it includes payments not only for work that is part of actual production yet unpaid, fetching water and fuel and work that contributes to production, but also domestic and other work in the home that generally contributes to the stability of the household and the community. The way the pricing model has been designed is that the recognition for unpaid work is paid as a premium, which is part of the product price. The cooperative decided to focus on collective empowerment and so created a revolving credit and savings fund of which they manage, rather than paying the women directly for the work that they have already done. The money is used for individual and collective savings and enterprises. It is open to any women in the communities where the cooperative has presence. The women have to save individually and collectively, and their savings are doubled, and credit is offered for both individual and group businesses. The women also receive additional training related to their business and other developmental subjects. To date, there are over 120 women and 10 women's credit and savings groups functioning at the Sesame Cooperative, and news has spread in Nicaragua. This initiative has been a catalyst for other cooperatives and crops to follow suit. It is also, we believe, the first known initiative in fair trade to value women's unpaid work in a pricing contract. And so 10 years later, the model is still in practice, and this is all well and good, but little is known about the impact of such a model. The Body Shop was keen to measure this impact and to see if the new pricing model is effective and if it could be applied to their other crops and supply chains within which they work for, which is why they invested in a collaborative studentship and my PhD. So I'm going to fast forward now a few years and speak to some of the initial research findings and reflections. Findings reveal that the recognition of unpaid work can lead to gains for the women participating in the initiative and their families. While changes were noted in a number of areas, several key achievements stand out. Firstly, there's been an increase in income and an ability to diversify. Participants noted 27 different income diversification strategies. There has been an increase in household decision-making and bargaining power and a change in intra-household dynamics. One participant said, "With this initiative, we're becoming empowered. You no longer have to lower your head and wait for the man to tell you what to do. Now we make our decisions and share activities and responsibilities with our partner." They've also had access to external support and services, and so for the first time, the cooperative has noted that there's been more women than men entering the cooperative at the General Assemblies. There's been access to and participation in different networks and organisations, and this has helped put care on the agenda not only locally with other organisations and NGOs, but also nationally and internationally. The awareness raising by the cooperative, of the Sesame Cooperative, has filtrated to other communities and cooperatives in Nicaragua, and the model has been adopted. Internationally, buyers and cooperatives have replicated the model. We know of examples in Mexico and Guatemala, and the Body Shop example has been used in different discussions and new emerging literature on unpaid care work, and is being cited as an interesting model of a market-led approach to recognising unpaid care work. However, there are a number of challenges relating to the implementation of this model. First, the findings show that economic empowerment is not enough and only goes so far. For example, in terms of time use, new projects and businesses can create burdens on time and income as women have to work harder and contribute more economically. My findings found that women's workload often doubled, and there was an assumption generally about the elasticity of women's time. Women still had to care, and yet were given further work and responsibilities as they became organised. So not only were they now responsible for the reproductive and productive work, but also community work, and furthermore care of the environment in some cases. Persistent gender-assigned roles, as well as social and cultural norms, remain strong. Some of the women commented that they continue to perform their duties despite fatigue, stress, or being time poor. Furthermore, a significant number of the money-making enterprises were categorised by gender and often based in the home. There was an overall limited engagement and reflection about gender roles and responsibilities, and the care for the main part remained women-specific. There were also barriers due to cooperative governance, as buy-in from the co-op and family members to address the issue of care work was missing from project strategies and initial discussions. Early findings from the study found that there is a need to collectively review the distribution of responsibility of care work with families and with cooperative members who are working on the programme in order to achieve a vision of a co-responsibility for care. So there's some important reflections and conclusions from the research so far show that for some the initiative was empowering, and for others the pricing model, created increased burdens. It must not therefore be assumed that women are a homogenous group, or that increasing women's income will always lead to maximising individual gains, or that everyone who participates begins at the same level or under the same circumstances. Neither can it be assumed that the household is a harmonious space free of conflict. The challenge for future projects is to encourage debate between all members of the family about the distribution of roles and responsibilities, as well as facilitate debate about the construction of gender identities, which informs the division of labour. This is the same for the community and institutional level. Deliberation and spaces of reflection are important in this process. And further, any project that focuses on unpaid work must have the 4 elements known as the 4 R's: recognition of unpaid work, reduction of unpaid care work for women, redistribution of the work and roles between families, communities and institutions, and representation of women and their needs in different spaces. So why is this case study interesting and what can be learned? Well, firstly, it's an example of a private company addressing care by implementing an innovative pricing model. The model places a positive value on care and connects production and social reproduction. It argues women's unpaid work represents an important input in production and should be valued and recognised. It's also a transferable model with the potential to be scaled up. Will it create a race for the top for other ethical buyers, like Enrich mentioned in his last presentation? Certainly within the specialty coffee market in Nicaragua, buyers are following suit and competing to have a slice of this model. The emphasis on learning and research by the Body Shop has also proven to be a lever for change. Participants have reported that just by asking questions about care has opened up discussions on their roles and assumptions about who they are and what they can achieve in the future. Potentially, this could influence a paradigm shift. And so to conclude, as Rosalind Ivan highlights in her article, Getting Unpaid Care onto Development Agendas, naming and framing are important choices. Naming it, as in talking about care, makes it visible, and framing it as a value and with a cost rather than a burden is critical to success. She also talks about the importance of challenging system bias and strategic ignorance, which is something that this case study demonstrates. In the case of the Body Shop, they included a cost for women's unpaid work into their pricing, with very little hard facts to begin. They didn't need masses of evidence to be convinced to adjust their practices. This challenges arguments and system bias that you need sound evidence to prove its importance and make changes. The Body Shop also brought to the forefront something that has been invisible in pricing and what Ivan calls the silent institutional rules of the game, the invisible power which keeps us in line. Further, the Body Shop challenges strategic ignorance. Often it's easy to ignore care as it would cost more money, or what Ivan describes as an inconvenient truth that would oblige a reassessment of policy priorities and budgets and might even challenge one's understanding of how the world works. The Body Shop acknowledged that they would have to pay higher prices and realised that this could go up even further pending the conclusions of my research, but committed to this. This is an important step in directing attention to the situation of women in global supply chains and cooperatives and the role of buyers and the potential of change. It opens ways of thinking for companies, development agencies, academics, and certification systems. It also makes clear the significant subsidy that this kind of work, if it is not remunerated, makes to capital and the state. This issue deserves to be taken up as part of the strategies for gender equality being considered under the rubric of corporate social responsibility. The economic sphere is only one step, and in this case, the Body Shop example is an unusual one, and much can be learned from it. I hope this was useful, and I'll now pass you back to the moderator. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Felicity, for sharing your research findings. So we'll move on to questions. So one question that we've had come through, Erin and Felicity, why do you think that we see some companies kind of dragging their feet on gender equality in supply chains? Do you think it's company culture? Is it the financial cost of addressing such things? Or is it just kind of a lack of awareness that's built up?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question, and the answer is going to be mixed depending on the commodity, depending on how many tiers there are in the supply chain. I mean, some companies basically buy from someone who buys from someone who buys from someone, and there are 6, 7, 8 tiers, and they have no idea what's happening at farm level or at factory level. And so part of it is just the disjointed nature of some of these supply chains. Other times, I mean, some of the conversations I've had with companies in the food sector and the apparel sector as well is that they don't feel like it's their place to challenge the gender norms in the places they're sourcing from, particularly as a buyer rather than as an investor. So they feel like, look, this is a problem that broader society in that country or in that location has. We're a small part of the puzzle here. I'm not sure we could do enough about it, and we're not that comfortable challenging what the kind of pushback we'll get from our suppliers, who will tell us that these are cultural differences and it's not your place to come in and challenge these. So yeah, part of it I think is that not all companies have the power to make those kinds of changes, and part of it is that even where they do, they feel incredibly uncomfortable about doing so, and they're not sure about the attributability to them, even if they were to change some of their policies and practices.
That's great. Thank you, Erinch. Do you think that social media is having a kind of a genuine impact in terms of making companies more accountable and more transparent, or do you think that kind of issues are still not really addressed? It's not helping to address the issues in a deep way. Do you think it's having a genuine impact?
From my experience, and maybe Felicity or others might want to come in as well, but from my experience, it's making it easier for consumers to engage with brands, which is a good thing. So it's clicktivism is something that's grown enormously in the last couple of years, and it's very easy for people to sign a petition, post on a Facebook wall, and companies can't ignore that and don't ignore that. So their social media presence is very valuable to them. It forces them to engage with their consumers if their consumers bring up those sorts of issues. At the same time, we haven't seen a huge step change in the kind of transparency that would be necessary. And that's probably a whole host of business reasons, cost reasons, and also risk mitigation reasons. So it's not like companies are putting out the kind of information that would really tell us what the conditions are at the bottom of their supply chains.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi. It's a really interesting question because I'm currently doing some research which is more generally about feminist activism and how they can leverage social media for change. And I think what we see is that, as Erinch said, there is a lot more chance for leverage purely in terms of numbers. So if you can sign an online petition and demonstrate that however many million people care about this issue, and then you can post it in a very public way on Twitter, tagging in Mars or whoever it is that you have a particular issue with, then that brings activism and voices of consumers much more to the corporate store. But I suppose the flip side to that is that as we get into this era of clicktivism or social media, it doesn't take too long before that interaction between activists and corporates becomes professionalized, and that means that actually how much will corporates listen to what's going on in their Twitter feed and so on. And the other thing that we've been noticing in our research is especially discourses around gender and feminism. As we know, they are particular areas where you get online abuse and trolling and so on and so forth. So there's a problem here with trying to leverage social media for gender equality and feminism, but also the problem of activists getting burnout with how do they actually deal with abuse and deal with the relentless 24/7 nature of social media. So it's both an opportunity, but it's also a huge challenge about what we do in this new digital age.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erinch and Lauren. So we'll go to the final question. Okay, so this one, very interesting presentation is looking at global supply chains. I was wondering, where do the panelists see future research and practice going when it comes to addressing gender issues in local supply chains?
So I'm wondering what kind of methods, old and new, we can use as part of our research to capture real impact on the ground. And a lot of the chapters in the book were really, well, a number of them on supply chain issues in particular, were really good at bringing the voices of the so-called recipients or beneficiaries of gendered CSR into our, into the pages of the, really bring them alive, so to speak, or bring them out. And so I think that's been really important. And I was wondering if whether Lauren might talk a little bit about some of her methods she's used to help bring out on the ground impacts in local context in terms of supply chain.
Yes, thanks, Kate. I actually learnt a lot about the particular methodology that I used from Felicity when she was working at Twin Trading back in London, and that was a participatory methodology called Gender Action Learning System. So I don't know, Felicity, if you want to say a few words about using participatory and visual methods in gender and CSR research.
So throughout my research with the Body Shop case study, I've you know, I've been now researching this area for 4 years, and throughout that time, I've used a number of different methodologies, both quantitative and qualitative, and I've found that, for example, the quantitative side, which was really important to capture time use surveys, and women's use of time was important, but I've always, throughout my research, used participatory methods, which Lauren has mentioned. I used a system called gender action learning, which was a participatory method of drawing a tree that would allow a discussion with women and men in workshops to look at how gender is balanced within the household, how decisions are made, how money is used, and how money's been spent. And then further to what I was saying about using a mixed method of quantitative and qualitative methods, time use surveys and measuring time has always been really important to the study to calculate, to look at how to calculate the price. And so I developed a visual tool that complemented and modified the time, a typical time use survey, so that women could actually see visually how their day, how they use their time. That led to interesting discussions within focus groups when it was compared with other women and also men and also other members of the household.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Felicity. I think that's the end of our questions now. Thank you to everybody for talking to us today, and also to everyone who's been listening. If you'd like to listen to today's session again, it will soon be available on the Greenleaf website, and that's also where you can find out more about the new book, and the 50% discount code will be sent out to everybody later today. So thanks again, everybody, for your time. It's greatly appreciated, and we hope this has been a thought-provoking discussion. And yes, head over to the Greenleaf website for more about the book. Okay, thank you and goodbye.